Hello, guys. I'm going to go ahead and apologize in advance. The sound quality, I'm not sure about. This is a new setup, so you may have to turn up your volume to hear me. It is January 22nd, 2016, and it's a snow day for Guilford Tech and about two-thirds of the state. I got word in time that the college would be closed, and I was able to get out last night and head east. It's not that bad here yet. It's sleeting now, and we do have some ice on the roads. So it gives me a great opportunity to do something I've been trying to do since the second day of the semester, which is get these videos digitized, updated, and posted for you to have at your disposal. This one is a lecture on respiratory emergencies. This was not before PowerPoint. I just wasn't using it that much in those days, so it's a chalk and talk based on the national standard, and it hasn't changed that much. If I have not forgotten completely how to use my software, if I do in the course of the lecture hear something that has changed, I'll break in and update it. For my second year students, this will be a good nuts and bolts review of respiratory emergency and probably some of the pharmacology that goes along with it. For my first years, this is probably your first paramedic level, or it may be, depending on when you watch this, your first paramedic level lecture on respiratory emergencies. Being a traditional lecture, I do write on the board, and that makes some of you cringe because some of you have witnessed that event live and in person and know that it's pretty bad. But again, with the software I have on these videos, I think I can caption it to where you can actually read it and actually maybe write down notes if you feel like you need to. By the way, I'm speaking to you, well, I guess it's still my office in Basin. Now it's an empty room. Most of the stuff having been moved, and I've got some renovations going on here pending the sale of this place. So if you're wondering where I am. But without, if I didn't mention it, this will probably be in 3 or 4 parts. If you watch closely, I think you'll pick up some stuff that you're going to get tested on for the rest of your paramedic career. And so let's jump into TARDIS and set the date for January 6th. At least that's when the series began. And let's talk about some respiratory emergencies.
My outline, I just don't have it ready this day. Like I say, we're jumping ahead, and technically I'm supposed to be starting patient assessment. But in preparation for the coming of our illustrious medical director, I'm going to begin with respiratory emergency. I've been told I look ill tonight. Do I still look ill? I didn't mean to. If I did. Still battling this cold a little bit, so bear with me. First of all, let's get a definition out of the way. Respiration, and I would suggest that you know this, the definition of respiration: the exchange of gases between a living organism and its environment. Now, you look very confused, hon. Here we go. In my book, it is 233. Yeah, starts in there. Actually, you're right. It goes back farther than that. Starts on 219, airway and ventilation. Respiration, the exchange of gases between a living organism and its environment. Note in that definition, it doesn't say anything about the lungs going in and out. It just says the exchange of gases. The last thing we'll talk about in anatomy and physiology is the exchange of gases, how that happens. First, we're going to talk about some anatomy, the structures of what we consider to be the upper airway. Now, in the old days, if I had more board space, which I don't, I used to draw this stuff, and I'm no artist, but so you're going to have to cruise along with me. Beginning with the most obvious structures of the upper airway, the nose, and the cavity immediately behind the nose called the nasopharynx. If you were to say, if you needed a definition of what the nasopharynx is, excuse me, it is the area directly behind the nose, separated from the oropharynx by the hard palate. And like I say, I do not have, I'm sure if you look in your book, you'll find an illustration for that. The nasopharynx ends where the oropharynx begin, which is at the level of the hard palate. Why am I telling you this? In practical knowledge, it really doesn't matter, but I guarantee you on some test, if not mine, somewhere they're going to ask you that question. What are the boundaries of the nasopharynx? And so I give it to you. The mouth, the laryngopharynx, the epiglottis, and the vallecula, all of those, I'll read those again for you. These are structures of what we consider the upper airway. And in respiratory and anatomy, we differentiate, we separate the upper and the lower airways. And we'll talk a little more about that. But the structures of the upper airway, the nose, the nasopharynx, the mouth, the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, the epiglottis, the vallecula. And let me scribble that one down, and this may not work out with this when we being tethered. God, I hate this board. The vallecula. Say what? I doubt seriously you're going to be able to follow along too much, even though I did get a lot of this lecture right out of your book. But I do this in a way that makes sense to me. The book tends to go from anatomy to chemical changes to this, that, and the other. Anybody read this chapter yet, perchance? If you're wondering why I don't outline this book, read it and you'll understand. This chapter, because it does skip around a lot, and the book typically tends to give you a lot of information. I hate to say that you don't need, because I don't think there's any such thing as too much knowledge, but in its little flights of fancy, it sometimes takes your mind off of what you really need to be studying. It's impressive. I mean, now don't get me wrong, it's very impressive, but it doesn't serve a lot of purpose. One more time, for those in the gallery, the nose, the nasopharynx, the mouth, the oropharynx. I'm not really concerned at this point about your spelling, but if you need a spelling, it's O-R-O-P-H-A-R-Y-N-X. The laryngopharynx, and if you got a real old-timer, you might hear him say the hypopharynx. That's still operable, although no one uses it too much anymore. It's called the laryngopharynx. The epiglottis and the vallecula. These are the structures of what we consider to be the upper airway. Once we hit the larynx, we are getting into the lower airways. Talk about those in a minute. First of all, and I'm going to tell you something else, it may be of a functional knowledge to you, may not, but I can guarantee you somebody somewhere is going to ask you. If I don't, somebody will. Functions of the nose and the nasopharynx. Number one, I can't just write on this like I used to write on my other one because it gives. I have to chase it. Follow me. Provides an interest for air. Very basic function. We need a way. You can breathe through your mouth. You lose some of the benefits that scientists tell us the nose provides us with. But it provides an interest for air. Number two, it warms the air entering the body. Not a great deal, but it does warm it to a degree. Probably as much of importance as the next one, which is it humidifies the air entering the body. It provides some filtration of the air. Something that will help you when you study anatomy is to get the things that are pretty well constant out of the way. There are basically two types of fluid produced by the body for lubrication and for protection. Serous fluid, and I think I can spell this right, serous fluid, and then mucus. Those two are basically your lubrication and for defense. Now, if you want to know where these are, here's a clue for you. If the area has contact with the outside, the area we're talking about, generally it's going to have a mucus lining. If the area of the body you're talking about, wondering what type of lubricant or membrane it has for protection, if it has contact with the outside of the body, generally it has a mucus lining. If it does not, for example, well, in the context of our lecture tonight, we're going to talk about the pleural spaces. Inside the little area between the visceral and parietal pleura of the lungs is serous fluid. Doesn't have an opening to the outside side, but the lungs do. Not the pleural space. It shouldn't have an opening to the outside. If it does, this person has a severe problem. So, if the pericardial sac has serous fluid in it, and hopefully nothing else. If it has anything else in it, we have a problem. And the last thing that the nose does is it provides us with the olfactory sensors, or the sense of smell. Behind the nasopharynx, of course, is the oropharynx. If you needed a definition of that, it's the cavity directly behind the mouth, ending about the level of C1 is where they consider the oral cavity to end and the laryngopharynx to begin. The lowest division of our upper airways is the laryngopharynx. And we have structures in there that we will become very, very proficient at identifying. One that is really, it's more of an anatomical landmark than it is anything else, is the vallecula. And this is the area immediately superior to the epiglottis. For you Mac users out there, this is where the tip of your blade ideally should be. I happen to be a Mac user myself. I've always been scared of laryngospasm. And I mean, it's not, one's better than the other. I mean, you know, some people will swear by a Miller blade, the straight blade. Some will swear by the Mac. I happen to be one that swears by the Mac. I've just always used it. Oddly enough, or it's not that odd really, but females tend to like the straight blade better. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but if you use the Mac blade, you're lifting the entire musculature of the face up. When you put the blade in the vallecula and you pull up, you're lifting the entire musculature. When you use a straight blade, you're putting it directly under the epiglottis and lifting that. Doesn't require usually as much upper body strength. I have a double advantage in one, that I'm male and I have naturally more muscles up top side than ladies do, but I'm also left-handed. This is my dominant hand, and I have more pull. The epiglottis, very quickly, it's a dome-shaped or a leaf-shaped tissue muscle, guards the entrance to the larynx. You don't really need to know this, but it's a very tough little structure. It's has a lot of cartilagenic properties, and it's also very sensitive to touch. If you've ever, and that's, you know, if you've ever had something go down the wrong way when you're eating or drinking, you will see just how sensitive it is. One of the reasons for rapid sequence intubation, the urge to get something out of that area when it encounters the epiglottis is reflex. We don't plan that. Nobody thinks about that. And sometimes people who need to be intubated just refuse to lose that reflex. And you got someone trying to gag while you're trying to intubate them. One of the reasons we take them down, to get rid of that gag reflex, so that we can drop that tube in. How many of you ever had a patient that needed to be tubed and you couldn't because they never lost their gag reflex? I had a man blew the top of his head off and never lost his gag reflex. Never once. That's pretty bad. He shot himself and didn't realize he was dead for 2 weeks. The vallecula is the origin of the epiglottis. This is all basic stuff you probably remember from EMT and EMT intermediate, so we won't labor it. Something that I've been debating on whether I need to do with you guys, functionally, whether it does any good or not, I can already tell you no, it doesn't. And that is to learn the different cartilages that make up the larynx. I'll give them to you, but as for actually identifying them, we won't worry too much about that right now. When we go into doing, there's one in here you will have to know how to identify because you're going to stick a needle in it. So we'll have to get into that. Right now I won't worry too much about it. But the interest of the trachea made from several different cartilages. They are the thyroid cartilage, the arytenoid cartilage. Let me write that one up here, just in case, because I'm not sure I could spell it. Arytenoid. Is that right? No. There's an E in there. Arytenoid cartilage. And these are, incidentally, I put these on this list in descending order from superior to inferior. The cricoid cartilage, this is the one we'll need to know. The cuneiform cartilage. And the corniculate cartilage, and I'll write that one down because I don't think I can spell that one either if I didn't have it in front of me. If you are trying to follow along in your book, you'll be already having fits because these structures were not in the early stages where they should have been. They were later on.
The one just ahead of that, how you spell that?
Cuneiform.
Yeah, if you don't mind, write that.
I don't mind it a bit. I just want to write it where y'all can see it. Cune. Yep, there's an E in that one too. Medical terminologists love to put E's in things that they shouldn't be there. And when I run the world, I'm going to banish them. Cuneiform. Being left-handed does come in handy sometimes. You got your board over here. The anatomy of the trachea is kind of important. Trachea is composed of C-shaped rings of cartilage that gives it resiliency and it gives it rigidity. However, we must always be mindful of the fact that it can't be fractured in the classic sense because you can't fracture something that's not a bone. We often say, and you'll hear it sometimes, well, they fractured their trachea. That's not exactly true, but it can be damaged to the point that it's not open anymore. It's not bone, it's cartilage and fibrous membranes. I don't have... One of the things that was very beneficial to me, whether I wanted to admit it or not, and I didn't want to because I didn't enjoy it very much, was having to go to an autopsy. It's one of the best abject anatomy lessons you'll ever find. You hear us talk about all these structures, but when you can actually see them, a trachea, I don't even know how to describe it, but it is extremely rigid. It almost feels like it would be bone when you feel of it, but it can be fractured. I've lost my notes. Here we go. Remember that the larynx, which I'm kind of want to go back and make sure I tell you, contains the vocal cords, and it's partially anchored to the hyoid bone. So is the tongue. I intend to bring my little friend in here, my skeleton, and we will locate the hyoid bone if you don't already know where it's at. And we'll talk a little more deeply. I'm kind of rushing my anatomy because it's not really all that important to what we're going to get to. The main bronchi, the point of bifurcation. If you don't know what bifurcation means, you'll hear it a lot. It just means splitting. The trachea will branch down until it bifurcates to the right and left main stem bronchi. This usually happens in most adults at around the level of T4 and T5. If you're curious about where that is, and I'm not much, when we go to do practicals and we do skills testing, you'll see these EMTs and paramedics rolling people up on their back and palpating the C-spine. Most of them could pass over 3 fractures and never know it. It takes a very practiced hand to pick up anything but the most obvious fracture in a spinal column. I've seen it done, but usually it takes an orthopedist, someone who's done it a whole lot. It's kind of like listening to heart sounds. That's another skill that I was taught that we don't waste a lot of time teaching you guys. You want to get good at heart sounds and lung sounds, you need to listen to healthy people. Most of the time we have this bad habit in EMS, we don't listen to lung sounds until we've got a sick patient, so we don't know anything to compare it to. You want to get good at listening to lung sounds, listen to healthy lungs. Then you'll know what a pair of unhealthy lungs sounds like. And that's the way with heart sounds, and it's this way with palpating C-spines. But you can palpate T1, which is a very prominent vertebra. Just you follow your C-spine down, and that big bump you run into is T1. And 5 vertebrae down around that level, which is about right here, is where your bifurcation starts to split. Of course, we know that the right main stem bronchi is a little bit straighter than the left. This bifurcation point is called the carina. Is that a term anybody's not heard? I know, in the old days, intermediates wouldn't have heard it because you didn't intubate. Now you've probably all heard this. The bronchioles will branch further. First bronchi to the main pulmonary lobes, 3 on the right and 2 on the left. Another piece of trivia for you, does it really matter to us? Probably not. The fact that there are 3 pulmonary lobes on the right and 2 on the left. Not something that's really going to matter a whole lot in our realm, but it's something you might see on a test. That's not a hint. I'm just saying that's one of the reasons I put all this trivia in here, because this is the kind of stuff people love to pull up on their test. From there, segmental bronchi into the 18 anatomic segments of the lungs, and we're not going to go over the 18 anatomic segments of the lung. I had to learn them, and that really bit. That was another one of those, why do we need to know this kind of subjects? But I had to learn all 18 segments. Oh, I will do one thing. I'll go ahead and warn you right now. We haven't got there, but if you might want to start brushing up on the cranial nerves. My students hate me for it, but I make you know what they are and what they do. So just thought I'd throw that in there while I was thinking about it. That's sort of one of those things like the 18 lobes, but I do think it does make a difference. In neurological assessments, there are definite things that go wrong when those nerves are damaged, and certain ones are damaged. So I think it's necessary. The bronchi divide approximately 20 times till they become bronchioles. The whole system has a mucus lining with something called cilia. This is another thing you'll find in many parts of the body. Mucus lining with cilia, which are little hair-like structures that move foreign particles toward the upper airway. When they get to the upper airway, you are stimulated to cough. Oh my goodness. Bronchioles also have a smooth muscle layer, and this is very, very important. Smooth muscle, as we know, is not controlled by consciousness. It's controlled by the medulla, whatever controls the vegetative functions. And it can alter the size of the bronchioles, which is one of the primary problems we will be sent out to deal with. Asthma, for example, or just your base. Have you ever had? I've had bronchitis and had bronchospasms, where those smooth muscles just locked down and I couldn't breathe. And I'm talking about the type that wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning from a sound sleep. You'll feel like you're being strangled. Bronchioles do not have the cartilage or the cartilaginous, never could pronounce that, support. In other words, they're more pliable than the bronchi are. The main stem bronchi are much like the trachea, C-shaped rings of cartilage that give it rigidity. Bronchioles are not as rigid. Now let's look at this. We've taken you from the nose all the way down to the bronchioles. We've taken you from the nose through the cavities, oropharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, hypopharynx, into the trachea, through the larynx, or actually I should say past the epiglottis and vallecula, through the larynx, down to the carina, which is the bifurcation point, the right and left main stem bronchi. Now we've split even further down into bronchioles, and that's where we are now. Are we all up to speed on this? I went fast because I figure most of this is probably a review for you. If it's not, let me know. Something you don't understand, let me know. I'm just assuming since you've already been through intubation, you probably had, at least up to now, you've had this. All right.
What is that called? The epiglottis?
Actually, I don't think there's a name for the actual opening. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. It's just the entrance to the larynx. It's the trachea. The trachea passes through the larynx, which is nothing more than a set of cartilages. I don't think there's really an opening, the name of the opening. There probably is. There's a name for just about everything else.
The glottic opening.
Well, yeah, but a glottis, when you get right down to it, is nothing more than an opening. So basically, I mean, that's true. I've heard it said the glottic opening, but the fact is a glottis is nothing more than an opening. In medical terminology, you got several glottises in your body. You have glottis in your brain, 4 of them, if I'm not mistaken. We refer to them there as sinuses. And I'm not talking about these sinuses. I'm talking about the compartments in your brain. But that's a good point. You can call it the glottic opening. I won't get mad at you for that, because I have seen it that way. Bronchioles will continue to divide, carrying or providing a way for air to go to structures called the alveoli. And you've probably seen pictures of this. You've got your little bronchiole that comes down, and then you've got a series of little grape-like things that are alveoli. What I want you to remember about them for the purposes of this lecture is that they're about 1 cell thick. These are very thin membranes. And very, very close by in the lungs are capillary beds, and that's important, and we'll get back to that in just a moment. Capillaries are also about 1 cell thick. Very, very thin membranes. And that is important, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. The natural tendency when a person breathes is for these alveoli to collapse. They're prevented from doing so by a solution called surfactant. I'm sure it has a fancy name too, but it's a surfactant solution that truthfully scientists don't know a lot about. They're not even sure why the body knows to produce it, but it does. But what it does is it keeps these things, and it does, there's a big, long definition of what it does, but the bottom line is what it does, it keeps these things from collapsing.
This is one of the magic things that we can do is stop time and intervene in a lecture. I have to be quick though, because with old Rob and young Rob in the same place, it could cause a paradox that could unravel the fabric of the universe. I made surfactant sound rather mysterious. It's not. I wanted to touch on that for just a moment and update this for 2016. Surfactant is starts production in about the 20th week of gestation. If you do research on this, you're going to see mostly articles related to preemies and infants, because there is a condition called pediatric respiratory distress syndrome, or it used to be called Highland membrane syndrome. Preemies born too soon haven't started producing that surfactant, so they have severe respiratory problems, leading mostly to atelectasis. Excuse me. And it can be a real problem. It's composed of lipids, which are fats, and proteins mostly, and increases surface tension which across the alveoli, which keeps them from collapsing. I encourage you to do some more research on this. A lot of good stuff out there, but for our purposes here, I'm not going to go any deeper than this, because it's like killing a fly with a sledgehammer. One more quick thing, and then I'll come back to 2016 and get out of 2002. I apologize. I was battling a cold when I was doing this lecture, and you don't think about it, when you're mic'd up. You don't think about it when you're lecturing and you sniff or something, because the longer you talk, the more your nose runs and you sniff. But of course, on video, it sounds like a howitzer. I apologize for that. And with that, I will get out of here and let Rob from ECU continue his lecture.
Question so far? Surfactant. I'm going to write that up here for you. Yeah, I'm running out of room. I hate this board. S-U-R-F-A-C-T-A-N-T, I think. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. There's probably better spellers in here than I am. Now, so what?
Bad area in the book.
A bad area in the book? Do we have a problem? I mean, oh, said a bad area. I thought, what in the world has she found? Oh, my nose wants to run again. The lungs. Let's talk about the lungs. Virtually the entire thoracic cavity is occupied by the lungs. And these are very simple structures, actually. They are suspended in the thoracic cavity by the trachea, the arteries, veins, and the pulmonary ligaments, of which there are few. The lungs are basically suspended. That's important because when we talk about trauma, we talk about any organs that can move around, and virtually all of them can. They're not attached all that solidly, and I've seen them taken out. It's remarkably easy to take a pair of lungs out. They're not held in there by much. They're cone-shaped structures with the bases resting on the diaphragm. We hadn't talked about the diaphragm yet. Diaphragm, of course, as we know, is at the bottom of the thoracic cavity. And we'll talk a little more specifically about what it does. Basically, you can say with relative accuracy that the lungs themselves are like a sack inside of a sack, each one. The outer portion of that sack is a tough, fibrous, smooth layer of connective tissue, and it's known as the visceral, wait a minute, yes, the visceral pleura. The outer layer, the layer nearest to the thoracic cavity, is called the parietal pleura. I'm not even going to try to write anymore because I'll erase a few things, but it is spelled, visceral is V-I-S-C-E-R-A-L, P-L-E-U-R-A. It's the inner sac. And the outer sac is called the parietal pleura, P-A-R-I-E-T-A-L. P-A-R-I-E-T-A-L. Between these two sacs is something very important to us. It's called the pleural space. It is a space only, actually it's in name only. There shouldn't be a space. There's a potential space there filled with serous fluid that keeps the two sacs together. Think of it like this. If I were to bring two panes of glass in here and pour water on one and lay the other one down on top of it, what's going to happen? I can probably pick them both up. They're going to stick. And the serous fluid keeps these two sacs together in much the same way. What happens frequently because of trauma or disease is that potential space becomes a real space. Then we have a problem. So pneumothorax is developing at that time. There are other things that can happen there. We don't talk too much about it because there's just not a great deal we can do about it at the paramedic level. Sometimes the walls of the two sacs become inflamed. It causes a condition called pleurisy. You ever had it? Very painful, especially on inspiration. And what has happened is that potential space has become inflamed in there, and every time they breathe, they rub together, and it causes pain. Many, many times when we go out, we got a chest pain patient, we listen to their symptomatology, and you're thinking pleurisy, but you have to treat chest pain. I mean, many, many times they're feverish. They complain on pronounced pain on inspiration. Have a history of usually some type of infection. They had a cold or whatever else, and now they're having chest pain. And frequently these patients are not in the cardiac range. They're younger. They're not diaphoretic. Their color's not bad, but they're having chest pain. So the whole time you're thinking this is pleurisy or some other type of chest wall pain, but what do we treat for? We treat for cardiac. Pays the same, and nobody loses their certification over it. Because if you miss that call, if you say pleurisy and it turns out to be a heart attack, you're going to burn. Let's see. I've got to give you this at some point, and I might as well do it now. We're going to talk about volumes and some formulas and a bunch of stuff that I've always considered to be about as useless as it can be, but it's something that you will see over and over again. We're going to talk about volumes of the lungs, how much can we breathe. I've been a paramedic for about 12 years, and I've been in EMS for pushing 14, 15. Not once has any of these things ever came up, made a hill of beans worth of difference is what I did with the patient. But for some reason, I know that it was on, at least one of them was on the state test, and one of them was on the National Register test. Why they want you to know this, but they want you to know it. If you're going to be a respiratory therapist, this would be important. But since I'm going to give it to you anyway. We're going to talk about volumes here. Of course, we know the normal breath's about 10 to 12 per minute on the average. Some people more, some people less. We have two definitions I want you to know. The anatomical dead space. There is, we talked about the bronchioles and trachea. Well, none of those structures have alveoli. Gas exchange can't take place in the bronchioles and the mainstem bronchi. But in order to get air to the alveoli, those chambers must stay filled with air. You understand what I'm saying? Air, when you breathe in, you take in air into those dead spaces, the bronchioles and the bronchi. Usually this is about 150 milliliters of air that we consider to be dead space air. Because we move it, but it doesn't do any good. I mean, when we breathe, it goes in. If you've ever had the wind knocked out of you, what you've done is you've knocked the air out of that anatomical dead space. And it takes time for it to fill back up. You know, that's exactly what getting the wind knocked out of you is. You've been hit hard enough to knock that air out of that anatomical dead space. And there's another one that kind of goes along with it, and that's the physiological dead space. And I'll tell you why I put this in here. I almost didn't. Basically, in a healthy individual, it's going to be about the same. The physiological dead space is the anatomical dead space plus the volume of non-functional alveoli. In other words, air goes to those non-functional alveoli, still doesn't do us any good, right? So it's a physiological dead space. In the average individual, they're going to be about the same, in the healthy individual. But if you have someone with emphysema, the physiological dead space may be 10 times what it would be on a normal person. Alveoli are dead. And then the physiological dead air space becomes a factor, a chronic factor. Because they're moving air. The problem is they don't have the functional alveoli to process it. Tidal volume. This is one you'll see quite frequently. Tidal volume is, I'm going to give you the short and simple definition, it's the amount of air that goes in and out in a normal respiration. Usually about 500 milliliters, could be 500 to 600, I think is what your book says. I try to keep it simple and just put 500, but I'll defer to the book, say 500 to 600. However, if you really want to be accurate about what the tidal volume is, the functional tidal volume, you have to subtract that dead air space. You're moving air, but you're, technically speaking, your tidal volume that's actually doing any good is about 500 to 600 milliliters minus this dead air space. Truthfully, and for the purposes of what we're talking about now, you can forget that as far as I'm concerned. If you're asked the tidal volume, it's 500 to 600 milliliters. We don't want to split hairs and get into the, but functionally you're only moving 350. It's not really a factor. We got too many other things we have to look at here. Inspiratory reserve volumes. Have y'all heard these before? Have you? I figure some have, some haven't. I just didn't know. Inspiratory reserve. The inspiratory reserve is the amount of air that can be forcefully inspired. It's about 2,000 milliliters. I think your book puts it 2,000 to 3,000. And then at the, if we have an inspiratory, we have to have an expiratory. Ugh. Stop that. Which is always usually less. This is the amount that can be forcefully exhaled. It usually runs on the average adult male about 1,200 milliliters. So we got, what, 2,000 to 3,000 milliliters here, and about 1,200 milliliters here. Residual volume. We've been told, if you've taken CPR ever, one of the reasons that they teach the Heimlich maneuver is there's always a reserve of air in the lungs. That air that they're talking about is the residual volume. My gosh. Did everybody have that, by the way? Were they copying off of this? There's two reasons I write on the board. To emphasize something and to slow myself down when I know people are taking notes. So that's why it's important for me to write up there, because I know y'all are taking notes on this. Residual volume. Goober. This is the amount of air that remains after the expiratory reserve has been evacuated, usually about 1,000 to 1,200 milliliters. Having given you all of these capacities, let's talk a little bit about pulmonary capacities. And what a pulmonary capacity is the sum of two or more pulmonary volumes, which will come in real handy if you're doing respirator checks or something at a textile industry. Out in the field, I'm not going to lie to you, doesn't have a lot of use, but we're going to make sure you know it so you don't get backhanded by some test. The inspiratory capacity. Inspiratory capacity. This is the tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve. I just put TV and IR. The tidal volume. Did I say that right? Yes, tidal volume versus inspiratory reserve. You take a normal breath, and then how much more you can forcefully breathe in, you have the inspiratory capacity. Usually about 3,500 milliliters. Oh my goodness. Here's a oldie but a goodie, the functional residual capacity. Functional residual capacity is the expiratory reserve plus the residual volume. So this is everything you can forcefully exhale plus what's left. Unfortunately, I'm not sure, but I think the only way to measure what's left is to kill you. But they can measure it somehow, I'm sure. I'm being facetious. I'm sure they can somehow do it. This is usually about 2,300 milliliters. My nursing people in here, y'all remember this? Did you have to do this? Good, I don't feel so bad then. I had to go through it, and I'm thinking, gosh, I hope I'm not throwing this at them for nothing. I just know I've seen these on test. National Registry had a few of them. I got two more for you. Vital capacity of all of them, all of these things, this is probably the one you will hear again if you hear any of them again. Vital capacity. I don't have any respiratory therapists in here, do I? Believe it or not, I had some friends and had some students that were respiratory therapists, and not only did they already know this, but they said they heard it quite a bit. If you're in respiratory, I suppose you talk about these things a lot. They matter a lot more. Vital capacity is one that you may hear again in some mode of your service. The volume of air moved on deepest inspiration and expiration. If you wanted, and sometimes you'll see them expressed this way, and I did this just so I remember to do it. It equals the, let me make sure I got it right, because I don't want to. This is vital capacity, and you could express it this way. The inspiratory reserve volume plus the tidal volume plus the expiratory reserve volume. I got to check and make sure I told you that. If you wanted to write it in a quick way, inspiratory reserve volume plus the tidal volume plus the expiratory reserve volume would equal the vital capacity. Usually this is going to be around 4,600 milliliters. And the last one that I'm going to give you, thank God we got through these pretty quick, the total lung capacity, which should tell you by the name what this is. This is the inspiratory reserve plus the expiratory reserve plus the tidal volume plus the residual volume. This is the works. This is everything. The total amount the lungs can hold, usually around 5,800 milliliters. So if a steamroller rode over your chest and squashed you flat, 5,800 milliliters of air would be probably the most you're going to get out. Questions about any of those?
Inspiratory, expiratory, tidal, and what?
Inspiratory, expiratory, tidal, and residual. Couple of rates I want to get. Minute volume, very quickly. Minute volume. And they've cut these. There used to be about half a dozen of these. I'm going to give you two. Minute volume equals the tidal volume times the respiratory rate in 1 minute. Very simple. The minute volume equals the tidal volume times the respiratory rate in 1 minute. Got one more for you. This is the minute alveolar ventilation rate. Minute alveolar ventilation equals the tidal volume minus the dead space air times the respiratory rate. Now, had to put it somewhere. We got it behind us. Like I say, guys, and I'll say it one more time. I know that I'm not going to lie to you. It's one thing I will try not to do. If I think something's worthless, I'll tell you I think it's worthless. But I do know you'll see it again. If not on my test, you'll see it somewhere down the road. So know it. Actually, the one that I remember the most is vital capacity, tidal volume. And I want to say, I seem like I remember total capacity, but I'm not sure. But I do remember those. Questions? When we return from a break, we will continue with a little more anatomy on the thoracic cavity and the diaphragm, the muscles of respiration, and hopefully we will get to the neurogenic control of respiration coming soon to a classroom near you right after this break.